Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to the ECM podcast. I'm Caroline Fontagneux, and I'm very happy to host this series that will take you behind the scenes of new music on ECM Records. In this new episode, I had the pleasure to talk once again with Vijay Iyer about his new trio album on ECM, Compassion, recorded with Linda Mehan-O and Tyshawn Sorey, and co-produced with Manfred Eicher. We talked about the state of the world, the bond created when playing music with someone, album titles, and compassion. But first, I wanted to know, how was Vijay starting this year, 2024?
Oh, the state of the world is pretty troubling. So that is always close to my day-to-day thinking and feeling. But I got to rest a bit over the holidays. I was with the family a lot and just bracing for the new onslaught of, interviews and concerts and facing the world again in this particular way. And also getting ready to teach some more.
You've been touring another project a lot last year. Does it feel like a homecoming feeling to just like touring again with the trio, or is it just like a different feeling?
It's a different feeling. Meanwhile, the jazz universe kind of keeps transforming. I feel like it's in a peculiar moment right now. It's a transitional time, I would say. For as long as I've been active, since the 90s, the whole jazz business was kind of but I'd say dominated by elder musicians who were of a certain generation, like basically Herbie Hancock's generation. He's basically one of the last standing of that generation, I would say, and still, of course, extraordinarily active and sounds as great as he ever did, which shocks me every time I hear him. But I think there's a sort of shift in focus. This music has always kind of revered its elders, and now I feel like it's shifting toward what's new, what's young, what's hot, and what's viral, and this kind of stuff.
I see what you mean, but Herbie and Keith and Chick and all the dads,
yeah,
were young at some point too, and they were
hot
and hip and young, right?
Yeah, I mean, one thing they all had in common was a connection to Miles Davis, and so that was the sort of link to the past that was a kind of mark of authenticity. Today there's just it's a different energy now. It's a different sense of accountability to the music's history. So it just means that those of us who come from the 20th century have a bit of a different, have to move a little differently today than we did even 5-10 years ago.
I want to talk about the trio with Linda and Tyshawn before we talk about the music. How is the relationship evolving in time? You know each other for a long time now. You've played in several settings. You toured a lot. You recorded several different projects. How the relationship is evolving within the trio and also between, each of you?
Well, I think both Linda and Tyshawn are really having their own moment now, as artists in the world. They have, the rest of the world is caught up to what I already knew. Put it that way. They also they both have little kids. Linda has a 3-year-old and Tyshawn has a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. And they both have teaching jobs. So their lives are really full, What's rewarding is when we reconnect around our music and are reminded of how deep these ties are, like familial kind of ties among us. There's, a lot of time together, a lot of shared experiences and shared discoveries.
Intimacy, really.
Yeah, it's like family in that sense. It's like say within a heartbeat that Tyshawn's like a brother to me at this point. Which means also that it's a lifelong kind of bond, and that it can come and go out of focus. It can come into focus and out of focus and back into focus. But it's always there, like in a kind of reassuring sense, when I see
There's
them.
this pressure. Yeah. It's just like, I know that if we don't play for a year or if we don't talk for 6 months, we're going to just get back to each other. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, trust is the word that people always use among musicians, but that almost doesn't capture it, because it's I think it's deeper than that. More like it's just this lifelong bond, I guess.
Yeah, because also there's something about trust that can be broken, or not broken is too strong of a word, but like trust can come and go.
I think very often. I remember Jack DeJohnette's album, The Chicago Project.
Yeah.
I think that was what it was called. Is that the right title? Made in Chicago. That's what it was called. With Muhal and Roscoe and Red Gill, and is it Leonard Jones on bass? The video for that they made for ECM, Mr. Abrams says something that the first time I heard it, it really shook me, but I've never forgotten it. He said, basically what he said is, when you make music with someone, that creates a bond that can never be broken. And when I really sat with that, yes, that is so true.
Yeah.
It's really true.
I'll use that. When I listened to our previous conversation that we had recorded to talk about your previous album on ECM, on Easy, and there's a word that you use twice to talk about first Linda and then Tyshawn, and you use the word compassion.
That's nice. I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was funny to notice. I mean, I have to ask you, of course, what does this word means to you? It's a strong word. It's a very strong word, and it's a strong sentiment. And in today's world, what does compassion mean to you?
Yeah, I should have a good answer. Often when I arrive at these titles, I mean, first of all, it's true about both Uneasy and Compassion that is the name of a piece on the album. And so I just named the album after that piece, right? So there's a piece called Compassion, and why is it called that? And I remember where I was when I wrote that piece. It was in the time between pianos for me, when I got rid of one piano and received another. There was a week in between, and I arranged to spend some time at Steinway practicing on their piano, and some other time at Columbia at Miller Theater. So I remember I was on stage at Miller Theater on that piano that they have there, which is quite old. It has it's lived a lot. It's had a lot of history. And so sometimes in these old pianos, it's almost like they're haunted, and you find some other kinds of sounds in there, or other progressions, or you just find yourself moving differently on it. So that's kind of where that was born. And then I didn't really know why, but it felt like the title for that piece should be Compassion. And it was really just all a purely intuitive response to a certain moment, This was, I believe it was January of 22. In fact, it was the week before we played at the Vanguard last time. So I remember that. So often these titles come from a feeling. And also, like, these two albums are named, the name they are given is the name of a feeling, right? Uneasy is a feeling, Compassion is a feeling, which is to say it's not a concept, it's not a big idea, it's actually just a response that one has to certain stimuli or certain conditions. It's an affective response. And I felt like that was the right way to go, which is to say it's not it's not a concept album. It's actually coming just from the space of feeling. You know what we mean when we use that word is a sense of respect for and accountability to someone else's life and someone else's experiences. But that happens through shared feeling, that you feel the plight of somebody else. So it just seemed like the right word for the moment we were in then and the moment we're in now.
Yeah.
Even though those are 2 years apart. It's always time for that, I guess.
Yeah, it's always time for compassion. As a listener, not as a performer, not as an artist, but as a listener, do you get influenced by titles? Maybe if the album had a different title, I would approach it differently. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is there a maybe subconscious desire to give some kind of direction in the listening experience for the listener?
That is the least I can do. And with instrumental music, any text you place alongside it, whether it's an album title, a song title, it does become a kind of prompt for the listener. Listen like this, or sit with this while you listen. Hold this in your hand while you experience this sound. So I do think of it that way, as a kind of, it's a frame, you could say, or a juxtaposition, or a stimulus of its own. I think I may have even talked about this last time. There's an essay. I don't know if you read the book, Henry Threadgill's autobiography that he wrote with my friend Brent Hayes Edwards. So Brent is a literary scholar, brilliant, totally brilliant thinker, professor at Columbia, and he spent years working with Henry on that book, and it's an incredible achievement. But earlier, he wrote this. His previous book is called Epistrophes, and it's one of the chapters in there deals with Henry Threadgill's title. I can't remember the exact title of that chapter, but it contains the phrase "the micropoetics of song titles," which would say that each title has a sort of poetic intensity. I would just say it has an ambiguity or multiple possible meanings, or there's something often inscrutable about Henry's titles. Like you just stare at it and you're trying to make sense of, or it'll have this kind of whimsy to it, or this sort of strange contradiction in it, or it'll refer to something that you don't know, and so you have to just sort of, it becomes this field of possible meanings without giving you an actual meaning. So that helped me understand certain things about what titles do, especially with instrumental music. I've always been somebody who arrives at titles very intuitively. It's basically like I will find myself kind of free associating until something sticks, But it's not random, that process. It's really a process that produces meaning, and it matters, and it's kind of, I don't take it lightly, So I do know that these different titles invite the listener to sit with the implications. Whether it's compassion or panegyric or tempest or ghost-strumental.
You mentioned ghost-strumental, and I'm thinking about Where I Am, ghost-strumental, and It Goes, that are part of this project Ghost Everywhere that you composed a few years ago. I mean, Ghost Everywhere is a strong title. Who are the ghosts around you? There are a lot of references and homage to, like Desmond Tutu and Jerry Allen and Emmett Till,
Yes.
your father. Sometimes we tend to think of ghosts as negative presences, but maybe it's not.
Yeah, that title, Ghosts Everywhere I Go, was the name of that suite. It actually came from Eve L. Ewing, a poet whose work I was I was creating with and in response to. And it was that phrase is not from one of her poems. Rather, I think it was around sometime in the pandemic when people would do these like "ask me anything" on Instagram type things. And so someone asked her, "Do you see ghosts?" And she said, "Everywhere I go." So that was that. Then I asked her, like, "What if we title this project "Ghosts Everywhere I Go"?" She said, "Yeah, that feels right." Because she's someone who, I think, like many of us, and certainly like me, she thinks about history. She studies history. She discerns and critiques its influence on our present, and then she speculates different kinds of futures, different possible futures. I mean, that's what artists do. She's a poet and a sociologist, so she has a sort of discipline to it all. So there is that kind of, in studying history, you're dealing with some people who are still here and many who are not, right? I think also that the fact that this album is somehow a result of the last 4 years, and particularly the last two, but it is sort of in the shadow of a period of immense loss, and so it is haunted in that sense that there is this kind of specter of mourning around. But also, like, how do we celebrate those lives, and how do we take care of those memories and not let them kind of get subsumed by our overwhelming present, So that's, I think that's kind of like with each of these pieces that has like a sort of tribute intention to it, like the one for Desmond Tutu,
Yeah.
or the one from her father, or the one for Emmett Till. They might have some kind of melancholy in them, but they also have a sense of celebration in them. And it's not just the fact that they're gone, but who they were when they were here.
And there's also the tribute to Chick Corea.
Yeah.
Tell me the story of Overjoyed.
Yeah, so this very peculiar thing happened. And it's interesting because it happened just as my father was at the end of his life, that I received this message from this young man who had acquired Chick Corea's piano, and he asked me to hold on to it for quote unquote some years. He didn't really say how many years. So yeah, that gigantic 9-foot piano is parked in my living room like a Buick. It's huge. But it was very mysterious how it happened. Like, I don't know why I was chosen. And even the fact that it happened while I was in the hospital with my dad, I said, like, that was when he reached out to me, and I said, I just handed it off to my manager because I was like, I cannot deal with this right now, and I don't know if it's real. It seems pretty unreal, but it turned out to be real. And in the course of getting to know this young man, or finding out about him, he sent me some messages, and as the piano arrived that week in January of 2022, he sent me Chick's final live stream, which I hadn't seen. It was only this wordless solo performance of that song. So that was like pretty poignant, to witness, because it was a very simple and sweet message, like this message of contentment, actually, it wasn't like he wasn't in some tragic space, he was like, it was a space of pure gratitude. Yeah. So then I just tried to learn it myself on the same piano. And in the course of that, it sort of transformed into this other version that is a sort of celebratory kind of version of the same song.
Except for 3 tracks, the rest is your compositions. And I was just trying to imagine, like, how do you write? What's your process of creation? Do you record a little voice note on your phone? Do you sit at the piano and let the melodies come to you? Do you think of chords first? What's your process of creation and writing?
You know what's funny about the trio music is that I find it really hard to create trio music. So instead, what I often end up doing is adapting other things I did into the trio format, which then means that I have to play a little differently. You know, I have to fill up space a little differently because that was true even with like break stuff with that trio album, that most of that music had been written for a large ensemble, actually, like a 20-piece band. And then reducing it to trio meant I had to almost like create these dubbed versions of the music, or these sort of like radically reduced versions where instead of fullness, it would have this kind of mysterious emptiness, So that's often what I do, is that actually I'm writing with a different ensemble in mind. Like that's the case with the pieces from that project called Tempest, which I think are three of them, right? Tempest and Maelstrom and Panegyric. And it's also true with the Ghosts Everywhere I Go music, which is three other ones. So it is often this process of adaptation and like reinterpreting my own in a way that the trio format sets off. So in terms of like, how do I write? I mean, I don't know. I tried everything. Sometimes I just find some chords I didn't know could work together. Sometimes I create a constraint, like the piece called Maelstrom is modal, like it's very modal. It's diatonic. Doesn't use a chromatic palette, which means that the material, like all the material has to come. I mean, all the intensity has to come from something else. Like not because all the ingredients are very familiar. So it ends up being more of a rhythmic exercise, a rhythmic space of expression, and a textural kind of like, how grand can we make this thing? So it's often these different kinds of constraints. Sometimes it comes from my hands at the piano. Sometimes it just comes from like writing for trumpet or something, and then trying to readapt that back onto the piano.
Vijay Iyer about his new trio album on ECM, Compassion. Thank you for joining, choosing, and listening to our ECM podcast. I'm Caroline Fontagneux, and I look forward to sharing more music with you in the next episode.